Hi everyone. So this is our third lecture, I suppose. First for this week. So if you looked at the readings for the week and read them, that is awesome and ideal. We're going to be talking about the existence of God and arguments for the existence of God and just the basics for this type of philosophy of religion. So it should be fun. So thank you to everyone who submitted a critical summary for last week. If a grade isn't there for you, then just email me and maybe I missed it somehow, or maybe it wasn't uploaded right or something like that, and we will get that fixed. But they were great, and I think I already said this last week, but yeah. So for today's lecture, should have already submitted the critical summary if this is one of the ones you want to do, and by the time you're watching this, I may have started or completed grading. We'll see. I'll work on that this week. So by the end of the week, always, you'll have your grades back. And if you don't, then there could have been a problem. So just email me and let me know. I do appreciate the emails and the questions. I know the first week I was like a little bombarded and I was like, oh gosh, we gotta read the syllabus. But now I'm getting like great questions and I appreciate everybody like wanting to be sure they're doing stuff right. So that is great. Keep it up. And yeah, always let me know if there's ever circumstances where you might need extra time or anything like that, and we'll get it worked out. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope that you're enjoying your classes and that this weird semester isn't making things horrible for you. Hope you're all getting settled and everything like that. I have gotten a couple of emails from people who have already been exposed to COVID, so be safe out there. I hope that everybody comes back with negative test results and feels good. So anyways, we'll get started. So first we'll start with just going over the basics, like some definitions that you might need, because once we get deeper, like things like theodicy or cosmological argument or ontological argument, those will be words that we just use, and so we want to make sure we have a good foundation of what those words actually mean so that whenever we're using those words, you know what's happening and you're not super confused. So first, the book or the chapter starts with the big question, does God exist? And I like that it says that because it kind of makes it seem like you're going to get an answer, like, does God exist? Yeah, he does, or no, nope. But obviously that's not the case, so that will have just an answer right in the middle of the book. I just thought it was funny how it's worded. So one of the first things that the author mentions is that we need to define our terms. So this is something you'll find in a lot of philosophy and is a tool that can really help you in everyday life, is being conscious of the definitions of the terms you're using. For example, like today, in this day and age, we're hearing a lot about justice, and so many people are operating from different definitions of what justice is. So if I'm saying I'm fighting for justice and you're saying you're fighting for justice and we're not doing the same thing, then that can be really confusing. So if you ever start an argument or have a disagreement with someone, or you're just trying to get to know someone's position better, the number one best thing to do is define the terms at the beginning of the conversation. Because as this textbook explains, sometimes when people say God, they just mean this God of the philosophers, meaning like this absolutely perfect being. That does not necessarily mean the God from the Bible as we know it. Or it doesn't mean God as first cause either. God of the philosophers, when we use that phrasing in this class, that's going to mean an absolutely perfect being. So that could be totally different from the God of the Bible. Somebody could be using it in a totally different way. So if you give me an argument for that type of God, and I go, yeah, I believe in the God of the Bible, yeah, for sure. That could be a big misunderstanding because that's not actually what you were proving. You're proving something totally different. And if I refute your argument for the existence of the God of the Bible, that doesn't mean that the God of the philosophers doesn't exist, right? So if I successfully defeat you in an argument for the existence of the God of the Bible, that is not to say that an absolutely perfect being doesn't exist either. So those are just examples to keep y'all thinking, like, make sure that you have definitions of your terms in your head, that you're not confusing all of these. Because especially whenever you make an argument in your paper, if you confuse these, that's going to set yourself up for a less than convincing paper. So yeah, the book goes on to explain, like, there's the God of Scripture and tradition, which could be like the Christian God, or it could be the Jewish God, or it could be the Muslim God. Those are the types of gods we're talking about whenever we talk about the God of Scripture and tradition. And then you get the God of the philosophers, which, as I explained, just means an absolutely perfect being. So that doesn't mean that God, like, loves people, right? It just means absolutely perfect. So that could be really distinct and separate from the universe that we live in, right? So the God of the philosophers could have nothing to do with us. The God of Scripture and tradition does have something to do with us. So that's one way in which those are distinct. Then you get God as first cause, which, as we'll talk about when we get to Aquinas, this is what he's talking about, or Aristotle. They're making arguments for, basically, there must have been something at the beginning of time that made everything exist and come to be, that caused everything that exists to exist. So essentially, it's not the case that something came from nothing. Something had to come from something. So there had to be a first something. That's kind of the argument. And once again, that doesn't necessarily prove that first cause is absolutely perfect, or it doesn't prove that first cause is the God of the Scriptures. So once again, keep that in mind. These are distinct definitions of what God is, or who God is, depending on your definition. And then you can also get people who, whenever they say God, they just mean, like, something of meaning. Like the reason, your purpose for living could be God. Once again, distinctly different from the others that we've discussed. So, one reason it's so important to keep these separate in your mind is because if I make an argument for why the God of the philosophers exists, so if I make a ontological argument for the existence of God being a supremely perfect being, and then you object with objections about the God of Scripture, you did not successfully refute what I was saying, because we're actually doing different things there. So you want to make sure you're on the same page as who you're objecting against, or who you're in support of. Because you don't want to, like, read Anselm's argument for a supremely perfect being and then be like, yeah, I'm glad that we agree that there's a first cause, right? Because that's not what he's saying. So, I appreciated that the book gave us like 3 just ground rules for philosophical theology. The first is to figure out what the author means by their own words. So, your first job when reading someone's argument is not to have an opinion. Your first job is to determine what this person was trying to say. And as we talked about earlier, this is where charitability comes in. Reading it in the best light. Because if you read it and make the author say something that they're not actually trying to say, then your argument against it is not gonna be successful. But if you take the best of what that person is trying to say and you're still able to object to it and refute it, that's totally successful, and that's what you need to be doing. So, then the next one is determine what his or her argument is supposed to be. So kind of similar to the first you're trying to figure out the meaning of what they're trying to say, and then you're determining what their argument is, what it's supposed to be. So take the best version of what they're saying, and then if you make an argument against that and you're successful, then that's way better than taking the worst version of their argument. And then the third one is to decide whether the argument establishes its conclusion. So instead of attacking the person, or instead of like just going on a tangent, making claims that aren't true, focus on the argument. Does what this author is trying to do, is it successful? Does it reach the end that they're trying to reach? So if you're objecting to it, the answer would be no, and you would have to explain why. So you would have to point out in their text, where it went wrong. You can't just look at an argument and be like, it was pretty good, but I just don't believe it because I think this. Not a great way to argue. The better thing would be to look at their argument and say, these were the points they were trying to make. This is where it went wrong. So they made a leap in the middle, right here, wherever it is. They made a leap that wasn't actually a logical step, or something like that. Then you can explain why. And we'll have an example of that in Anselm's argument for the existence of God. Another thing to keep in mind is that, like we talked about the different types of, or different definitions of God someone could be operating under, it's also true that somebody could say God and mean something that like nobody really means when they say God. And in that case, that's not really helpful for anybody, because somebody could say, well, actually God is, something obscure. And then in that way they try to get around different objections. That's just kind of co-opting the language of theology for a purpose that has nothing to do with theology. So I would encourage you not to do that, not to just name things God that like nobody else would say is God, because it's confusing, and there are probably better words. So always be mindful and careful with the words you use, because you don't want to be using somebody else's language to make a point that they never wanted to make. So just a few definitions of things. We kind of went through the basics, but first I should explain philosophical theology, because there's theology proper, meaning just the knowledge of God, so the study of who God is, or what God is, or whatever it may be. Philosophical theology is taking philosophical tools, maybe like you could use logic. So I saw somebody did that for their thesis, using symbolic logic, so a formal type of logic, to prove the existence of God. So that's a way of using philosophy in order to prove or help your theology. So philosophical theology is a little bit more speculative than proper theology. If you're interested, there's a ton of philosophical theology. But someone like Jonathan Edwards is a good example of what philosophical theology looks like, because he's from the 17th century, 18th century, 1700s. And he did a lot of metaphysics and used a lot of philosophy to basically just prop up his theology. It's interesting. Anyways, I just wrote a paper about him. That's why I'm like suggesting him. So that's kind of what we're working with in the philosophy of religion is philosophical theology. So one term to know is natural theology. And natural theology is, the purpose is to determine whether God's existence can be established by philosophical reasoning informed by ordinary experience. So in my everyday experience, can I see the existence of God? Or can I make an argument just from like what I experience in my everyday life for the existence of God? You have kind of two different routes to go with this. You could either go the a priori knowledge route, meaning that before I actually ever have a sense experience, I am capable of having knowledge. So I talked about this in the history of philosophy. The rationalists, they made the argument that you can know things strictly from your mind, from reason alone. Meaning, I don't have to go out and actually like touch something to have knowledge of it. I could just have it from my reason. So that would be a priori knowledge, meaning before experience. So to remember that, prior, a priori, so before experience, you're able to have knowledge. So Anselm is using this route, which we'll talk about. You've read it though, hopefully. Because you don't have to have any type of experience for his argument to work. It just works by you thinking. Let's see. There are other arguments that don't. So something like the design argument, which would mean like, okay, I look out and I see there's actually an old paper written about this, and it's about a watch. So if I'm walking on the beach, walking, and I look down and I see a watch, my thought is not going to be, oh, whoa, like, I can't believe the universe just made this watch, right? I'm going to be like, somebody made this watch. This didn't just appear. It didn't just appear out of thin air. So from looking around the world, my thought in this argument shouldn't be, oh, this just popped up out of thin air. Like, this whole universe came from nothing. My thought should be, oh, I see like all of these things in this room and in the world kind of fit together and move, and I have this body and I'm able to talk and use it and walk and all of the things. So my thought should be, somebody made this. That's the argument. So that would be an argument, a posteriori argument, meaning after experience. So after I have seen the world, seen things inside of the world, experienced my body, then I come up with the argument, somebody must have made this, right? So that's not something that can be established by reason alone. I actually have to see and hear and smell and all of the senses to come to that conclusion. So those would be the two different routes you can go with natural theology. So let's see. So a posteriori arguments are going to be based primarily on physical evidence. So maybe an argument for, or people can use evolution as an argument for atheism. So they could say, we have actual evidence of, I don't know, dinosaurs or something. So that means, the argument is more nuanced than this, but that means God doesn't exist. So they're using like actual evidence, things that they have to experience in order to make this argument. You can't do that with evidence. Sorry. You can't make that argument without evidence. So that means that it's a posteriori. So someone like David Hume, who we'll talk about, he's from the modern period, which, like I said, is around the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. He said that everything is based on sense experience. And so people still believe this today. Those who are materialists would say that everything is material. So you don't have a separate, like, reason thinking thing that is also just material. It's just nerves, like, making things happen. Sorry, it looked like I had like a bicep for a second, which is not true. So anyways, so someone that believed in a priori knowledge would say that you actually have the faculty of reason before you have those nerves. And I don't know science, like I said, so I don't know how that works, how somebody would argue in that way. But that reason is separate from the body. That would be an a priori argument. Anyways, kind of going on a tangent there. So something to one term to know is the cosmological argument. So I think we'll talk about the ontological momentarily. Hold on. Okay. Let me explain that first. So the ontological argument is what Anselm made. It's the argument that so God must exist because God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. That is the ontological argument. And you could probably have variations of that, but that is fundamentally what the ontological argument is. It's that if you can think of the greatest thing ever, that thing we're thinking of as God, because God, if we look at our terms, define our terms, God is a supremely perfect being. So if we think of a supremely perfect being, it exists in our understanding, and, well, I'll explain this in a sec. The point is, that's the ontological argument. A cosmological argument is what Aquinas is arguing, that there had to have been a first cause. So we'll go more in depth whenever we get to Aquinas, before the end of this. Then you get an argument like the design argument, which is what I described with the watch analogy. It's basically just looking like the world looks like it was designed. So it makes sense to conclude that the world was designed because that's what it looks like. So you can think of it like, if you learn in physics, I learned this a long time ago, so forgive me if I don't represent it correctly or explain it correctly, but that things are always tending towards chaos. And if you look around, this doesn't look very chaotic. So if physics tells us that things are tending towards chaos, and we look around and, like, I have this body that's capable of moving and speaking and thinking, and that, like, none of that is chaos. So it seems as though humans and other things like this pen were designed. So that would be an example of the design argument. Now, something that we want to be careful of in philosophical theology is not falling into the trap of using God when we don't have a good explanation for something. So, let's see. Okay, maybe we could just use like evolution as an example. Well, you don't want to look at something like, I'm trying to think of a good example. The point is that you don't want to not have an explanation for something and just be like, oh, it must have been God, right? So even in what I was just saying, if you just look around and you're like, yeah, things seem to be in order, which seems like, somebody designed it, must have been God. Like, that's doesn't hold too much weight. You can definitely fill in that argument and make have more weight to it, but just something like that, just saying like, yeah, I don't really have an explanation for why that's the case. Could be God. And then like actually using that as an argument is not a great thing to do, because there are things in science that like a long time ago we didn't have answers to that we now do have answers to. So with like I'm trying to think. So people could have looked up in the sky a long, long time ago and thought, oh my gosh, there's like all these tiny dots in the sky. Like, that must be, I'm totally making this up. I don't know if anybody ever thought this. That must be like heaven peeking through or something. So they could have said like, that is proof. That's God, because we don't know what those holes are. So it's probably God that we're seeing. And now with modern science, we can say those are just stars. So science will come to explain away some things, not everything, not all things, but you don't want, that can lead to a very weak argument to just be like, I don't know what it is, must be God. Something to watch out for and be careful of. Now, another more recent argument that we'll talk about for the lecture on Thursday is the cosmological fine-tuning argument, which is that that there are fundamental constants in the world. And if those constants had been any slight amount of different than they are, the world wouldn't exist. So if we were like, I don't know, a centimeter closer to the sun, I don't know if this is true, I'm sure somebody knows, then we would burn up. So something so slight looks like there's a designer fine-tuning things, or that has fine-tuned the world. There are more examples better than what I just gave that we'll talk about, but those are kind of the basics for philosophical theology as we will talk about it in the class. Now, sometimes, or you can look at the arguments for the existence of God and be like, these are not good, they're not convincing. And you might see that as a case for atheism. Just being like, okay, I was not convinced by all of the arguments for the existence of God, therefore God probably doesn't exist. That's not necessarily the case, because we want to keep in mind there's also the option of agnosticism. So it could be the case that we just don't know anything about the God that may or may not exist. So Gnosticism, or the root of the word Gnostic is like secret knowledge. So agnosticism would be the denial of having this knowledge. So it's basically just admitting we don't know. It's another way to say that, we just don't know. And a lot of people take that position today. It's probably, I don't want to say the easiest position to hold, but it does, I don't know. It's, you don't have to have a strong stance. You can just be like, it could be either way. But it is a strong stance in some sense because it's a principled refusal to answer the question. So you're actually standing strong in that, saying, I refuse to answer because I don't have enough information. I don't have enough knowledge of what's going on. So keep in mind that if you make an argument for atheism just by denying theism, that you're missing out on agnosticism. So you would need to refute that as well. So the argument against theism, the one that is used from history's past to today, just it has been the biggest argument against theism, is the argument from evil, or the problem of evil, as we might speak of. It's basically why, if God is perfect, why is there evil in the world? If God is perfect and he created the world, why is there evil in the world? And this argument is so compelling because of how, I think, emotional it is. So if something horrible, tragic happens, the hardest thing to do would be to say that God is good, or that, yes, God did this, or God allowed this. Just fundamentally to our human nature, I think that's like jarring to think or to feel, because we feel the depth of the evil. So, especially with everything going on in the world right now, if there's a good God, then why wouldn't he stop the murders of black people that are happening? Or if there's a good God, why wouldn't he stop COVID from infecting and killing people? Or if there's a good God, why wouldn't he step in and put an end to sex trafficking? Like, all of those things immediately garner an emotional response. And that's, I think, why it's been so effective. Or not necessarily effective, but has stood the test of time. Because I think everybody at some point, no matter what you believe, has probably had that thought or that feeling. And so for someone who believes in God, that's something that you must answer to eventually. So the refutation of that objection is called a theodicy. So if you believe in God and you have an answer for the problem of evil, that would be called a theodicy. And there's tons of those as well. So I was just thinking of like the problem of evil, and I was listening to a song yesterday, and it was even in that, like in a very like poetic song, the singer says, you say there's a God, but I've got friends that have died from heroin, so what's your God trying to prove? So just in like art, the problem of evil is everywhere. In TV, you'll see it everywhere. So just knowing that that's what it is can kind of bring an awareness and an interest in philosophy in general, because that's a philosophical question that's mixed into a song or whatever it may be. So anyways, it's a good song. It's by Sorority Noise. If you've ever listened to them, they're pretty good. So yeah, a theodicy would be an answer to that. And I think we'll talk about Eleanor Stumps on or next week, I think, actually. So that'll be good. And I might bring up some more. But anyways, something that you must deal with. So if you're thinking of paper topics, that's a big paper topic to write, like, I don't know, 5 pages about. But you could take, like, Eleanor Stump's response to the problem of evil and argue in favor or against that. That would be a good idea. Or, yeah, because you probably don't want to come up with your own because you don't have enough time to clearly write out what you're trying to say. So it's a lot of times best to look at someone else's work. And it also allows you to get better at reading what someone is trying to say. And instead of inserting your own opinion first, it's really a helpful skill to write what someone is trying to say. Anyways, I'll be thinking of paper topics. This is really interesting stuff to deal with. So, the first argument for the existence of God that we will be talking about is from Anselm of Canterbury. So Anselm is from the medieval period, if you remember from the last lecture. So that is, he's not at the beginning of the medieval period, but he's not really in the middle either. He's probably between the beginning and the middle. So he was alive from 1033 to 1109, which sounds like a time, but that is the years. So 1033 to 1109. That's when he was alive. And one thing to know about him is his, like, big, like, the slogan for his philosophy is faith-seeking understanding, or faith-seeking reason. So one thing that he's not trying to do is say that it's just be like, hey, here's an argument, now you should have faith. Or, I have an argument that will lead you to faith. That's never what he's trying to do. He says that he's starting from a position of faith, a position from a belief in God, and then explaining that. So, instead of it being understanding seeking faith or reason seeking faith, he's starting from a place of faith and then trying to explain the philosophy behind it. So it's almost like working backwards in a sense. Which I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with presuppositional apologetics, but for in the Christian realm, there is a lot of different types of apologetics. One of them is presuppositional, meaning that basically you're not going to convince anybody into faith, but you can explain why it's the most convincing and most rational option for a human to believe. Basically because in that faith, God is the one that calls to salvation. So you can never reason someone into salvation. That would be kind of the position that Anselm is taking, that he's not going to reason you into faith, but he has faith and he's going to explain that faith. Very interesting. So if you ever, I don't know if people outside of philosophy say this, but if you ever hear the phrase faith-seeking understanding, that is from Anselm. So he wrote a few different things, but the passage that we're talking about is from the Proslogion, and he also has a Monologion. So anyways, that's just true. It's not important. So the chapter 2, that God truly exists, in the reading, that is the ontological argument. So the language that he uses can be super confusing, and because it's like a lot of words, and it's like you probably could have said that simpler, but it's fine. The big thing to note is that Anselm's definition of God is that which something greater cannot be thought. So, or you could say, something than which nothing greater can be thought. So, to make that even more simple, the greatest thing you could ever imagine, that's God. The most perfect thing you could ever imagine is Anselm's God. So, his argument for this is that, which this is what I was trying to explain earlier and then realized that this is where I need to be explaining that if I say the most perfect being, you have an understanding of what I mean. You're like, okay, you're the most perfect being. Okay, I can imagine that. So at that point, the most perfect being exists in your mind, in your understanding. So Anselm says that existence is a perfection. So if we're talking about the most perfect being, and existence in reality is a perfection, then the fact that that exists in your mind means it must exist in reality as well, because it's even more perfect to exist in reality than to only exist in the mind. So if the most perfect being exists in your mind, then it must exist in real life. That might take a minute to sink in exactly what he's saying, because like I said, it is confusing. The word, it's hard to make that simple, but once you get a grasp of it, it makes a little sense. So let's see. He gives an example of a painter, and he says that a painter thinks in advance of what he's going to paint. So in that moment, the painting exists in his understanding. Now, when he actually paints it, it exists in his understanding as well as in reality. So that's how he kind of separates existing in your understanding from existing in reality. And so if you think of the most perfect being, you might be asking the question, why can't the most perfect being only exist in your understanding? So that would be okay. So if you said, okay, I understand what you mean by the most perfect being, but I don't think that it actually exists in real life. Anselm would say, if it was actually the most perfect being, it would have to exist in real life, because existence in reality is a perfection. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to leave it at that because sometimes I over-explain. So, by sometimes I mean most of the time. So, this is a quote. He says, "For if it exists only in the understanding, it can be thought to exist in reality as well, which is greater." So existing in reality is greater than only existing in the mind. This is something we'll return to in a minute. Because you should be thinking, what are some objections that could be made to this? Even if you agree with him, you should be thinking, what are objections that could be made to this? Because you would need to respond to those. And you need a good response. So that's his first argument. The second argument is really, really, really similar. It's just that instead of talking about the distinction between existence in the mind and existence in reality, chapter 3 relies on the distinction between things that can be thought to exist, that can be thought not to exist, and things that cannot be thought not to exist. So he basically says, you cannot think that God does not exist. God cannot be thought to not exist, because you're thinking of him as existing when you even have that thought. It's kind of a mind twister turner. It's a little crazy. So he says, his conclusion of that is, therefore, if that than which a greater cannot be thought can be thought not to exist, then that than which a greater cannot be thought is not that than which a greater cannot be thought. And this is a contradiction. Very just like mind-bending language. So I hope that me just saying it out loud with the right inflections kind of helps you understand what he's trying to say. Because then he concludes, so that than which a greater cannot be thought exists so truly that it cannot be thought not to exist. So basically, God, the supremely perfect being, exists so truly that you can't even imagine God not existing. Because you can't even imagine the most perfect being not existing, because whenever you have that thought, the most perfect being is existing in your understanding. I hope that makes sense. So, let's see. If you look at this argument, if you like lay out the premises, which it does for you in the book, there's a hidden premise in there. And it's important whenever you're like laying out arguments, if it helps you, to look at arguments schematically, as in first premise, second premise, third premise, then definitely spend some time looking at that in the book. Because if you look on page 11, at the bottom and top of page 12, it just lays out the argument, premise by premise. So the first premise is God is an absolutely perfect being, which is the starting place, because that's the definition that he's using for who God is. Then the next premise is we can think about God. Then you move to whatever we can think about exists in the mind. Then, mini conclusion, so God exists in the mind. Then, so either God exists in the mind alone, or God exists both in the mind and in reality. If X exists in the mind alone, then X is not perfect. So X is just a symbol for anything. If something exists in the mind alone, then that something is not perfect. So if God exists in the mind alone, God is not perfect. If X exists in the mind alone, then X is not perfect. That is a hidden premise. And what I mean by that is not that Anselm is like trying to pull one over on you, but rather that premise, there's a lot weighing on that premise, even though he doesn't actually outright state it. So he's operating with the understanding that if something exists in the mind alone, then it's not perfect. That is influencing and informing his argument, even though he doesn't explicitly state it. So whenever you write out the premises, you should write out the things that must be true, even if they didn't actually state it. So a lot of times a hidden premise is where you can find a good objection. So if you were objecting to Anselm, you can make the objection that it's actually not greater to exist in reality than in the mind alone. There is an objection that you can read about on page 12, Guanilo's Perfect Island. And if you wanted to write a paper about an objection to Anselm, this would be a really good paper to go read. So you can just look up Guanilo's Perfect Island, and you can find it anywhere, and you can use that for your paper. It gives you a little excerpt in the book. So Guanilo imagines this perfect island. He says, now if someone should tell me that there is such an island, I can understand his words easily. But suppose he went on to say, you can no longer doubt that this island, which is more excellent than all the islands, he says you can't doubt that it exists, since you have no doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent not to be in the mind alone, but to exist both in the mind and in reality, for this reason, it must exist. So basically his thing is, you could do that with anything. You can imagine the most perfect island, but we all kind of know that that doesn't mean that that island exists. So that's a good objection to Anselm. And Anselm actually has a response to that. So if you wanted to look up that, you could too. anyways, that's something to look into. If I can think of the most perfect unicorn, that does not necessarily mean that that exists in reality, right? That's an objection to Anselm's argument. And that point can be objected to as well. You could just keep objecting. Which, I don't know if I made this clear, but an objection is just pointing to a particular piece in an argument and disagreeing with it, pretty much. I mean, that's the simplest way to say. Yeah. So, that is Anselm. The ontological argument is super famous. Yeah. So, if you have any questions about Anselm, please let me know. But that's a great one to write your paper about. So, be thinking about that. Right after, or not right after, Anselm died in, I say 1109? 1109? Yes. And then Aquinas came in 1225. So not right after, but kind of right after. We get Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas is his full name. And he is very famous in Catholic philosophy and theology. And his big thing, and one of the reasons that he can be so complicated, is that he attempts to combine Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. And whenever you do that, it gets really, really technical. So as I talked about in the history of philosophy, I almost said episode, like this is a podcast, lecture. Aquinas is from the Scholastic area, and by area, I mean era, and that is a super complex era in philosophy, because trying to merge Greek philosophy and Christian doctrine makes a very complicated philosophy. So, even in his 5 ways to prove the existence of God, it gets like more technical than a lot of things. More technical than Anselm. Anselm's is confusing to hear, but the basic principle is kind of simple. Aquinas, there's like nothing about Aquinas that's simple. So he starts with he just goes through 5 ways to prove the existence of God. So instead of going Anselm's route and just doing like 1/1.5 ways, he just like lays them all out. He's like, I've got 5. So in some ways that can be helpful, because he's trying to like probably beat all the objections before they even come. But it can also seem a bit jumbled. So I'm going to actually write this. I think this will be helpful. So the first argument that he makes is the argument from motion. So this is kind of like his a cosmological argument. So it's I think this is backwards for you, so this might not be helpful at all. And I know I said this last time, but I, never figured it out. I guess I could just rewatch myself, but probably won't do that. It's humiliating to watch yourself yap for an hour. Anyways, so argument from motion is his first cause argument, pretty much. He says that motion is the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So if something has potential and then it becomes actual, motion had to move it to actual. And he says that nothing can be put in motion, nothing can move from potentiality to actuality, except by something in a state of actuality. Okay, so you get potential to actual, but something actual had to act on the potential. So, actual, and then you could just keep going, right? But Anselm does not accept an infinite regress, which would be if you just kept going backwards forever. He says there had to have been a first, right there, a first actual cause in order to make all of this move and keep going. So ugly. So just keep things simple. That is his first way. Now, the second way sounds super similar. It is also a cosmological argument. It's just kind of another way to think of it, but it's kind of saying the same thing, a little different. So the second one is an argument from the nature of the efficient cause. So this is what I mean by he gets technical, because the term efficient cause is a technical term. He's not just using efficient as an adjective. He's using it as a technical term. So, but the main point is that if there is no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate or intermediate cause. So a way to think about this is to think about everybody holding a chain link. Or just think of a bunch of chain links, linked together. Every link is an intermediate link. It's helping the next link, and the next link, and the next link. So if there was no first link, then there would be no intermediate causes or intermediate links, because they're not actually helping. They're all helping the next thing, but there can't be an effect without a very first one. So that's kind of confusing. It's kind of confusing. Because it really is kind of just elaborating on the first way in a more complicated way. I think you could probably just use the first one and not really worry about the second one. But, he seems attached to it. So I think, this second way is actually refuting the argument that there could just be an infinite regress. So, as I had potential to actual to potential to actual, someone could just say, yeah, that just keeps happening forever, backward. Like something costs something, which costs something, which costs something, forever. And so this second point, or second way of proving the existence of God, argues against the infinite regress. So that would be why it's necessary, but it is just kind of relaying the same message. Then you get a not cosmological argument. This is the argument from possibility and necessity. I hope you can see this. If not, it's in your book. So what he's saying here is that basically his point is that God necessarily exists. So he says that if everything is possible not to exist, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. But it's not the case that there was nothing in existence ever. So because of that, there must exist something that the existence of which is necessary. Which I know it is super confusing language. And the reason it's confusing is because they're trying to maintain the definition of their terms. Because they could just replace there must exist, instead of saying something the existence of which is necessary, they could just say there must exist God. But you're losing some of the clarification of your argument whenever you do that. So that's why it can be a little confusing. So, let's see. So imagine that everything in the world either had the possibility to not exist. Then it could be the case that nothing ever existed, which is not the case. We know that things have existed. Because of that, there has to be something that actually it's impossible not to exist. Yeah. So God is that which is impossible not to exist. Another way to say that is God necessarily exists. It is a necessity that God exists. Because if there wasn't a first thing or something that the existence is necessary of, then it could be the case that nothing is in existence. So you could find some holes in that one if you wanted to. Then you get to the fourth, and this is the argument from the gradation found in things. All right, so his argument here is basically that, let's see, there is something, this is similar to Anselm's argument. There is something that is uttermost being, or there is something that is uttermost perfection. There is something that is the most good, or the most right, or the most powerful, right? So if there is something that is the most of all these things, basically Anselm's perfect being, then there's this perfect being that encapsulates. That's the word I'm wanting to use, but I don't think that's the right word. There's perfect being that has all of these characteristics, is the point. So there must be something which is to all beings the cause of their being and every other perfection. So if I understand goodness because I see somebody doing good, like that's something that's good, I have this idea of good. There is a perfect good. That would be the hidden premise of this, that there is a perfect good. So because there is perfect good, that perfect good came from something or is something fundamentally, which would be God. That's probably the easiest way to put that. All right. Then, for our fifth and final, this is the argument from the governance of the world. You can't see what I'm writing. It's fine. I'll show you in a sec. All right. Argument from the governance of the world. So, this is the idea that everything that we look at, that we see, seems to be acting towards an end. So, let's see. Yeah. So, this marker, its purpose or its end is to write things or draw or whatever to make marks, right? So me as a person, my purpose is to, well, it kind of depends on what you believe, but we exist and we move towards a particular end or purpose. You can think of it as this water bottle has a purpose of holding water. Everything has a purpose, an end that it's moving towards. So Aquinas, looking around the world, so this is an a posteriori argument, from looking around, experiencing the world, concludes that natural bodies act for an end or towards an end. And so then he concludes that some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed toward their end. So I'm directed toward my end by a God. By the God. I mean, he's arguing for a singular God. Let's see. Like atoms and... I don't know why I always try and do science things, because I'm going to sound like I don't know what I'm talking about, because I don't. This marker is directed toward its end by a supreme being. Everything that exists is moving toward an end directed by a supreme being. So, all of these 5 arguments are for the existence of the God of the philosophers, as we defined earlier. Now, Aquinas and Anselm both had arguments for not the God of Scriptures, but they both did believe in the God of Scriptures. So you can have an argument for the existence of the God of the philosophers or something, and move from that and build an argument for the God of the Scriptures or something like that, because they both were very religious. Aquinas is a saint. So is Anselm. Yeah, anyways, interesting stuff. So those are from the medieval period, super influential arguments that have been used for forever. People still use these arguments for the existence of God. It's not like people look at these and they're like, it's outdated. Like, these actually hold some weight. So they're worth arguing for or against in your papers if you want to. On Thursday, we will talk about more modern stuff. And by modern, I mean contemporary. So it should be interesting. So your next critical summary will be due next Tuesday. So don't worry about it for Thursday, because there's just one due a week. And yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. And I'll see you later.